Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to build something super useful, a complete CRUD application using Angular and a fake JSON server. So this is our application which uses a fake JSON server to load a list of users, and it allows us to perform CRUD operations on it, which is to create, read, update and delete. These are the core functionalities for any real world application. So by the end of this video, you will have a fully functional Angular CRUD app with the API calls. So I'll just give you a demo of our application first. So we will perform the basic CRUD operations on it. First, which is to load the users. As you can see, these are the users we have in our backend. Once we reload it, all of these users are loaded here. Next thing we can do is we can create a user. So I can create a user called fake user, and I will create any email here, okay? And once I press add, it should create a new fake user for me. Here you can see. And if you go to our database here on our JSON server, you can see we have updated here. Now, if we want to edit a user, I can go on any of the user, and if I click on the edit button, our form, we are using our reactive forms, which will preload all the fields here. So I can change the name of the user, and I can say here change name. I can also change the email as well. I can change multiple field, so I can say change here as well. Once I click on update, you can see it has changed here. And if we want to delete a user, we can also do that by just selecting any of the user we want. For example, I want to delete Raul. I'll just go here and I'll delete, and you'll see it has gone. And all these changes are reflected real time in our JSON server as well. So that's how our application works. So let's switch to the VS Code and get started with our application. So first, let's create a new Angular project. For that, you need to open terminal, and we will go to our desktop. Once we have gone there, we will use our ng-new command to create a new Angular project. So we will write ng-new and our project name, which would be Angular CRUD app. This command will create a new Angular project. We will say that yes, we need a routing. We will go with CSS, and that's it. Depending on your internet speed, it will install those packages and create our Angular application. Okay, so it's been done successfully. Now I will drag and drop my folder to my VS Code. The folder, okay, and I'll just take it, put it into my VS Code, and now I have my Angular application loaded here. So I'll go into terminal in my VS Code, open a new terminal, and I will run the command ng-serve. So when I click this, it will take me here, which is my Angular CRUD app is running. So we have successfully set up our Angular application. Now next thing we need to do is we need to install a JSON server, which will act as a fake backend for our front-end application. Okay, I will go here again, create a new node branch, and I will install my JSON server. For that, we will be using our npm install command, which is npm install -g JSON server. This command will install a JSON server on our this project folder. Okay, so it has installed that. Now we need to create a DB file, a database file, which we want to keep track of, right? So we will create a new DB file, which will be called db.json into our root folder. Okay, so we will add the file here, and we will call it db.json. Okay, so inside this we'll create some fake data. Okay, and that fake data would be all of our users, and our users will be basically array of objects, right? So all those objects would be our each specific user. So I'll just copy paste here some users which will have their unique ID, name, and their email. So we have got a user with Alice, ID 1, and email, and Bob. Like this, we can have multiple users in this array of users. Okay, which we will be updating from our front end from now on. Okay, now next thing we need to do is we need to start our JSON server. So we will create a new node branch, and here we will say JSON server watch db.json. So it will start watching this db.json file and use it as a fake backend. Okay, now if we go to our localhost 3000 here /users, you can see that we have got both of our users, Alice and Bob. All of the details are here. So if we go here to our API, the one which we have created, localhost 3000 /users, we can see our users perfectly rendered here. Now next thing we need to do is we need to create our components to display these users to perform our CRUD operations on them. So I will here create one more node, and here I will say nggc. Inside components folder I want to create a user list. Okay, so inside our source, inside the app, it has created a components folder which have our user list files. Okay, html, ts and css file. Same we will do for our user form, because we need a user form to add our users, right? New users. So we will say we need a user form folder as well. So this will create our user form as well. So now we have both the components we need. These are the only two components we need, user list and user form. So next thing we will do is we will create a user service which will basically handle our API calls, right? The calls basically which we will receive to add, update, create and delete our users. Okay, so we will use another command which is ngg, and this time we want to create service, so we'll say service, and we want it inside services folder, and we want to call that service our user service. So this will create a service here for us, this one. Okay, now we will start writing our code with this service file itself. We will basically add all the logic we need to communicate with our APIs, which is this. So first thing we will do is, every time we do any kind of request which is create, update, read or delete, we need to go here localhost/users, right? So we will store it inside a variable. We will say private API URL, and we'll store this inside http localhost 3000/users. So whenever we have access to these users, we can do the changes we need to these users. Okay, so now whenever we are dealing with HTTP requests, which are basically this type of requests, we need to use HTTP client module. Okay, so we will go into our app module.ts file, and here we will put an import statement here, which is import HTTP client module. Okay, and after this we can write our HTTP client module here. Okay, now we have access to our HTTP client module all over our application. So we'll go back to our user service, and now inside the constructor we can say private HTTP of type HTTP client. Okay, so it will inject this from Angular common HTTP. This should be like this. Now we can use our HTTP to communicate using our post, put, delete and get request. Okay, to make this CRUD application, we are basically going to perform 4 crucial operations, which are get the users, next would be adding the user. Okay, after that we want to update the user, and finally we want user to have permission to delete the user as well. So get the user, we will create a method called get users. Okay, every time we load the page we want all the list of users, right? So for that our get users would be of type observable. Okay, and that would be of type any array, and which means this should return this dot http, and as we are getting we will use http dot get, and whatever result we are getting it should be array of users, right? So we will say it should be of type any array. Okay, and here inside we will give our API URL. Okay, so first thing we will do is get our users, right? So to get the user we will create a method called get users in our user service, and this method basically will return a type of observable array. Okay, so observable of type any array, and inside the method we will return, basically we want to go to our this http localhost 3000/users, and we want to return all the users, right? So for this we will be using our http, as this is a http request, right? So we will say this dot http, and we will use http provides with delete, get, head, like patch, post, put, all kind of method. So we will use http dot get because we want to get all the users, right? And inside this we will pass our API URL, this API URL where we have all the users. Okay, now this get would be of type any array, right? So we will write here any array. Okay, so this is our get users method, which basically returns our array of users. Okay, through this API URL. Now next method we need to do is add user. so we will say add user. So this method, basically this will be of type observable, and we can say observable of type any, right? The stream which will it return would be of type observable of any, as this we are adding a single user. And also inside the add user, as we want to add a user, we need to pass our user, right? So we will say user of type any, and here we will say return this dot http again, and this time as we are adding a user, so we will use post request, so we will use this dot http dot post, and which url we want to use, api url at this users you want to go, and you want to post that specific user, so we will pass our user. That's it. And now to update the user, we will use our update user method. So we will call update, we will create a method called update user. So this time when we want to update our user, we will pass our id of the user, right? Each user will have a id which we will create, which I'll show you later on. We will pass the id of the user, and we'll also pass the user itself. And this method, basically this would return observable of type any as well. So observable of type any, and here we'll say return this dot http. So as a response, what we want to do this time, as we are updating the user, we will use http dot put. So we will use http dot put here as we are updating the user, okay? And to do that, we will use this syntax, and we will say dollar and curly brackets, we will pass our API URL. As we want our, we will basically, whenever this method is getting called, we want to go to the specific path, so we are using like this dot API URL, and inside this we'll use a backslash, and as we will pass the ID, right? So we will write here $ID. So we will have that specific path, and we would be able to edit the user. So after that, here we will pass our user which we want to edit. So this is how we will be editing our user. We will go to that specific path and edit the user which we want to, using our ID, and for that we'll be using our put request. This is basic, right? And now for deleting the user, which is the easiest one, we will say delete user, and this time we will just pass our ID, and our ID would be of type number, and this would return observable as well. So observable of type any, right? Only this returns observable of type any array because it returns an array of users. So here we will say for delete user, we will say return this dot http, and it comes with our delete method, this dot http dot delete, and same syntax we will use. Here we will use the dollar syntax, and inside we will pass our variable, which is this dot API URL, and after this slash we want to dollar, and we want to pass the ID which we want to delete, that specific user. So here we pass $ID, so we go to that URL, and that $ID we want to call our delete method. Once we do this, we are done with our delete user method as well. So here we have done all of our 4 basic CRUD operations, which are create, read, update, and delete. Okay, now make sure one thing, that you have updated your HTTP client module here in order to use this. Now next thing, in order to add our user, we have created already user form component. So user form component, we will have in 2 input fields, which are username and email. So we will be going to user form component.html file and creating our user form. Okay, so before starting with get users, we will try to list all of our users, basically, which means we want to render all the users we are getting from this call, right? So in our main page, which is this page, right, user list component, this page will basically render all of the data we get from our get users. So here in our HTML, we will create a table, right? So inside the table, we will have a table row, and we will use our ng for loop to go over all the items, all the users we get from our fake backend, okay, from that API. So that will be, we will call those users, okay, and these users are nothing but, we will create here users, and they will be of type any array, okay, like this. So now inside the table row, we will have this td, and here we will display our username and user email. Okay, so here we will say user dot name, and we will have same for user dot email as well. So here I'll say user dot email. So now I will write one more, and here I will have two buttons. Okay, and both of these button, one of them would be our edit button and other one would be our delete button. So each user we want to give like these two buttons, right? So we can perform our edit and delete actions on them, and to add it we will be using our form. Okay, so now we have got our name, email, so that's how we will display the user, right? And next thing we need is we need to have a user form, right? So this user form we will load here in our parent component. So we will pass this user form from the parent to child. So we will say app user form. Okay, so with this we have made this app user form as a child component, and we have made this user list as a parent component. So with this app user form, what we will do is we will set all the details whenever user select that specific table row, right? That specific user, we want to pass that user to this form, so that if the user want to edit, we can allow them to edit, or if they want to add a new user, we can allow them to add a new user as well. So for that we will pass a property called selected user. Okay, and this property selected user, we use square brackets whenever we want to pass from parent to child, right? This is our child. So what we want to pass is we want to pass our selected user like this, and this selected user we will create in our ts file. And we also want to do one thing: whenever we perform a operation from our child parent, we want to receive it in our parent, right? This is basically triggered every time whenever our child they emit something, like whenever they have done a decision, like they have saved the user, either edit or delete them, we want to tell the parent that they have performed that action, and we want to reload the list again. Every time that happen, we will say we want to call our load users method. This method will go and refetch the updated list. Okay, so now, so it can get a bit of it, but if you already know the basic concept of parent and child component, it would be easy for you. And now I'll go into my ts file and implement this. Okay, so here inside the ng on init method, first of all we have got users of type any, right? And we will create our property called selected users, this one. So this selected user, right? And I will say selected user, this would be of type any, and I'll initialize it as null. Okay, now our this error would be gone, this one. So this is null in the beginning, and whenever our ng on init method is called, for that I will say we want to implement on init. Okay, and here ng on init. Okay, inside this method, every time the method is called, like our parent component, we want to load all the users, right? So we will say this dot load users, and we will create this method load users now. So after this method I will say load users method, and this method what it does, we want to call our user service. So we will write our constructor, and inside the constructor we will call our user service, the user service which handles all the backend, which is getting user, adding, creating an update, right? So here I will say private user service, and this will be of type user service. Okay, and like this. Now we have access to all the user service method here. So I will say every time load users method is called, inside this I want to call my user service, and that user service, as I want to load the users, so I will say get users, and once we have got those users, it will come in an array of observables, right? So we want to subscribe those, so we will say dot subscribe the data inside it, and that data which we are getting we want to fill in this users array. So we'll say this dot users equals to our data, right? So now the users array here, this one, they have our users, and we are displaying it, and we have edit and delete button for them, and also we are passing our selected user, whichever selected user we have selected, we are passing to our child component. So our child component, why we are doing this, I'll tell you. So that our child component can have all the details. For example, user has selected in the parent row 1, so we want to pass that row 1, right? And if user select row 2, we want to pass row 2 details like that username and email and everything. So if the user want, they can delete, or if they don't want, they can add a new user. So here what we will do is, so this should be selected. Okay, so this should be selected user. Okay, so now we can focus on our other method, one of which is edit users. So in our edit button, we will create a click event and we will say it should call our edit user method, right? And whenever our delete button is called, it will call our delete user method. Okay, so inside edit user, we need to pass our user, okay, the user which we want to edit. And for delete, we just need to pass our user ID. So we will pass user.id. And to edit the user, we need all the details, so we will pass our whole user here. Okay, now once we have done that, we will go into our TS and implement those methods. So we'll say edit user, this one, edit user method. Okay, and inside this method, it will receive a user, and that user would be of type any. And whenever we receive this, what we want to do, we want to select that specific user we want to edit inside our this selected user property, this one. So we'll say this dot selected user, and this inside the object we will use dot 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 and user. So it gets the actual property of the user, like this. Okay, so inside this dot selected user, we are passing our user details. Okay, every time the user click on edit. Same we will do for delete user, and delete user method, and this method will receive a ID of type number. Okay, and whenever this method is called, we want to call our user service, and we can directly delete our user. So we will call the delete user call, and that takes a ID. And with this observable, we want to subscribe. Okay, and after subscribing it, calling the final method, we will say that we want to call our load users, right? Because this call will directly delete the user. Then we want to refresh our list, right? So we will call our load users. Okay, and for edit users, we will do our main logic in our child component. Okay, and now we will go into our HTML here. So this selected user property is giving error because in our child component we need to give this property. Okay, so let's go to our user form component. Okay, so in this user form component, first thing we'll have is we will have an input and output property. So we will say input property, and the input property which we are getting basically from our parent, right? So what we are getting that selected user. So we'll say selected user, and that will be of type any. You see the error is gone. So selected user of type any or null. Okay, and we will give it an initial value of null. And we will also have an output property. So the output property is the one we want to send every time our user has done some changes, like whenever we save the changes, right? You can see here this one, whenever user saves some changes, we want to pass output event. So in our TS file here, we will say that same name user saved, and this will be new event emitter. So we use event emitter to pass our events, and this will be of type void. Okay, so now whenever we want to add a new user, we will be using a user form. So for that we'll be using reactive forms. So I'll say user form, and this will be of type form group. Okay, so make sure you go into your app.module.ts file, and here you have your reactive forms module imported, which is this one, reactive forms module. Okay, so now we can use our reactive forms module here. So inside the user form here, you'll just give an indefinite sign like this. Now we have our user form, and this user form is the one which we will submit every time we want to create a new user or edit a user. Okay, so we will create one more property, which is edit mode, and this would be false for beginning. We can just initialize it as false. Okay, this will all make sense once I have implemented our form. So just stay with me, and we will have our constructor. Inside the constructor, we will have a form builder. So we'll say private fb, which is form builder. Okay, and we will have our user service as well. So private user service, as we have user service because we want to communicate with our backend, right? So we will be using user service here, and this will be coming from user service. Okay, so inside the constructor, we will initialize our user form. So this dot user form, and this user form would be this dot form builder dot. We want to create a group, and that group would have different properties which we want to have in our form. So one of them is our ID, which will be empty, and name property, and we use basically array brackets, and we first value we have is our value we want the form to have. Second is our validators, so we want validators dot required, as we want the user to have a name, right? And same with email, we want beginning it to be empty and we want it to be required. Okay, so that is all with our user form. Now we will have our ng on changes method. So for that we need to implement it here on changes. Okay, now we will say ng on changes. So this changes property in ng on changes, this is basically an object of type simple changes. This will have all the properties that have changed. Okay, this is the ng on changes lifecycle hook, which provides us with this special property which basically contains all the changes which have changed. Okay, so we will be using those. So we will have a if condition, and we want to only do something here when we see that changes and dot selected user. If our changes dot selected user is triggered, right? If this has been changed and our this dot selected user is not null, then we want to say this method that, which means that user is editing. So this dot edit mode is true. Okay, you get it, right? So if our changes dot selected user, so if user has selected the changes and this dot selected user is not null, it means user wants to edit, right? So we want to set edit mode as true, and that time we will say this dot user form dot, we will use patch value. Now we use patch value whenever we want to edit specific field of a form and we don't want to change the whole form, right? So we'll say this dot selected user, so we'll pass that user whichever we want to change. Okay, so to solve this error we just need to put it inside like this. Okay, now we will just create our form so that we have idea of what we are doing. Okay, so we'll have a form here. This form will have a property called form group. Okay, this one, and this will be equals to our user form which we have created in our ts file. So inside the form here, first we will have one more property which is ng submit, which will get triggered every time our ng on submit is called. So for that we will create a method called submit form. This method will have the whole logic to submit our details, either to create or update the user. Okay, so now we will mention our input properties. So first of them would be our id. Okay, so our input, this one would be hidden because this would come from the backend and we want to set it automatically. And the form control name would be id, right? This is our first property, this one. Now next property would be, I'll just copy these ones. Okay, so next one would be our username. So it would be of type text, and form control name should be name, and placeholder we will say enter name. Okay, and we will have this for email as well. So this type would be email, and form control name would be email as well, and placeholder will say enter email. Okay, now there is one thing, we will have a button, right? Every time user select a table row, either they want to edit or they want to delete. So this button should either say if it's editing the user or it's deleting the user, because we will have the same field for either deleting or editing the user. So we need to tell this form what the user is doing. So for that we will say this button would be of type submit, right? So whenever this button is clicked, our this form ng submit will get clicked and this method will get called. So this would be of type submit, and what we want this button to display, the text, right? Sometimes we want to display it to edit, sometimes we want to display it to add. So we will say that we have the property is edit mode, and if that is edit mode property, if that is true, right, it means we want to edit the user, so we will display a text called update, and if that property is false, then we want to display the text called add. Okay, so this add, now you'll be thinking where is this edit mode is coming from. So if you go to our TS file, you can see is edit mode is false in beginning. So if it's false, it means every time user wants to add, which is the default behavior. But if it's here inside the ng on changes, right, whenever user has selected the user, then we are saying that is edit mode is true, which means that user want to specifically edit the user and not add it. Okay, so here if we go to our submit form method, this method, okay, and this method, basically inside this method, so inside this method we will have a validation. We'll say this dot user form, and if that user form is valid, then only we want to go inside, and after that we want to check if is edit mode is true or not. If it's true, then we want to implement our logic for editing the user. Okay, and if is edit form, if it's false, like, then what we want to do, our else case, which would be basically adding the user. Okay, so you get it, right? So first thing we want to check is if our form is valid, then only either if is edit mode is true, we'll edit the user. If that is not the case, it's a add case, we want to add the user, right? And we'll have another method called our reset form. This method we want to call every time we submit the user, because we want to reset the form, right, with empty values and make all the boolean values like these ones again null, like false. So we will say this method should have this dot user form dot reset. So this is an inbuilt method provided by our form, so it will reset all the fields, and we will make our edit mode as false again. Okay, so now if we go here to our edit mode, now when we want to edit a specific user, we will say this dot user service, and inside user service we want to update our user, so we will call our update user method. So this update user, this takes id and it takes a user, right? So we have access to both of them from our forms, right? So we will say this dot user form dot value, and we want to get the id. Okay, and next thing we want to pass is our user form, so we'll say this dot user form dot value. So why we are passing value? Because we need the whole user, right, which is id, name and email. Okay, now once we have done that, this form basically it will send a request to our backend, and that will give us a response. So we want to subscribe to that response, and from there we will call our arrow method, and inside that we will say this dot user saved, right? So our user is saved because this has passed and it has given us a response at this point. So we are saying this dot user saved, this output property we want to show to our parent that we have performed everything. So we'll say this dot user saved dot emit. Okay, and once this user saved dot emit is called in our parent component here, this will trigger. Okay, and this will call this load users method, and this load users will refresh our list with the new users from the backend, right, as we are updating or deleting. So going back again to our user form component here, this is one use case which is done, and once this is done we want to reset our form, so we will call our reset form. Now for adding the user, this is also easy. We will just say our user service, and inside the user service this time we will add the user. Now to add the user, we only need to send the user itself, that's it. So we will send our user detail, which is from the forms we have access to, the user form. So we will say this dot user form dot value. Okay, and once we send it and we return observable, we will subscribe to that observable, and inside the arrow bracket we will say this dot user saved. Okay, and we want to emit the event that user is saved to our parent, and then after we want to reset our form. Okay, so this is the whole logic done for our child component as well. Okay, now if we go to our app component.html, we will remove this and we will say our user list component, this one. So we'll say app user list. Okay, and this should display our app user list in our here. Okay, but you see it's looking really bad, like, so we'll just fix it with some CSS. Okay, so you can pause the screen and copy all the styling. So this is what we will have in our body container h1. Okay, and now we will give some styling to our form component as well. So we'll go to form component. Okay, inside this we will paste this styling. So we have given our form input and some padding and stuff. Okay, and some styling for error and stuff. Now lastly we will give styling to our user list as well. Okay, so here we'll give this, and that's it. We are just done with our stylings. Okay, so it looks really better now, and we have access to all of our edit button and delete button and all of it. Okay, now, okay, so I did one more change in order to make sure that we can edit our users properly. Like you can see here, I'm editing this user and the email, both of the things together. So you see it's updating properly. So in order to do that, I have to do more changes. So inside our submit form, I created a new user. Every time user submit a form, I will take the ID and I'll generate the user ID instead of keeping it as an empty string. So in our db.json file, you can remove all of it and you can restart the server, right, using our JSON command, which is JSON Server watch db.json. Just remove this object and restart it. And in our user form component, you need to create random unique ID. Okay, so you can use this .toString, and this new user, we need to use this field rather than what we were using before from our form. So every time we are editing our user, I'm also doing one more check, which is watching that if the selected user, if it has ID or not. If it has ID, which means we are editing, right? So that time I want to get that selected user and that specific ID, and I want to convert it to string and then edit that user, right? If you don't do that, then it will go to our JSON server here and try to find a random ID which doesn't exist. Okay, so in order to work with string and everything, I have made sure wherever we receive our ID, I have made it of type any, just to avoid any errors. And that's it. Now if we go to our application again, you can see that if I want to create a new user called Mike and I enter the email michael@gmail.com, you can see I can add a user properly. If I want to delete a user, I can delete this. If I want to edit the user, I can edit it as well, michael.senior, and you see it's all working. So you can update, create, delete, and you can get users as well. Every time we refresh the list, we get our users which are in the backend. And that's it. We have successfully built a fully working CRUD application in Angular, allowing us to create, read, update, and delete users, for which we used our JSON server. While doing this process, if you're stuck in any of the steps, then you can feel free to ask any question in the comment section and I can help you with that. If you found this video helpful, then please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.